I hear what you're saying. For me, it's two things. One is, if you're talking about places like Africa and Asia, where you've got the big exploding populations, we kind of tend to always talk about them last. They can't have children the way we've had it in a kind of unbridled way, and I think first of all, the way to reduce the number of children they're having is actually through things like education. It's actually through kind of human development. And also, they're consuming far less resources than all the rest of us. The second thing I think is kind of in this country, when we talk about it, tends to be we talk about it's like the families on the council estates who've got no jobs. I think, bloody hell, what about the parents of the heads of the banks? They raise worse children. They destroy society far more.
Thank you. Right at the back, there was someone raised their hand. Raise your hand again so you can get the mic. Or you can pass it straight there. Thanks. Yeah. Keep your hand in the air, otherwise no one will be able to see that you want the mic.
Sorry, I was just going to come back on that point when he actually answered it himself. But I was going to say that we always talk about big families as if it's a problem across the world. But the problem is that we in the first world are consuming far more than the big families in any other part of the world. So if we want to look at reducing consumption, we have to start with ourselves, not with any other one.
Okay, man here has patiently had his hand up. Sorry, making you guys with the mics run around a lot.
Poor parenting though, George. Poor parenting.
Hello. Yeah, no, we'll come back to that as well. But there's a few issues we can bring together on this one, I think. Anyway.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to make sure I'm not too controversial, but I was reading Zach Goldsmith's book, The Constant Economy. I admit I only read a few pages of it, and because as a Green Party member, I think he completely sold out going to be conservative, to be honest. He really stuck by his principles. That was another issue. But what I did read in there was he was saying the amount of unplanned or unwanted pregnancy per year was 80 million. And that's about the amount that the human race is sort of going up. I think that was the argument he was making. So obviously there's an issue there. But of course the question is, who has the right to say which parts of the world have more right to have more children? Is it us in the West because we're so-called educated and we're better at running the world than those other people? And then there's another issue which I've always questioned, is about the amount of aid and and I look at things, and this is controversial, I'm going to say it anyway. When I look at the things that the Bill Gates Foundation is doing, which is saving lives, which is fine, except what are those people going to do in their lives if they're not given what is needed? And is it going to be right to make them educated and give them a consumerist society when we've seen how damaging it's been for the part of the world that is driven by consumerism and economics?
I'll take two more quick points on this. There's a man here, and then someone else hands up. Let's see someone who hasn't spoken. Maybe this man after you, and then I'll say something. Yeah, go on.
Just a few points on this. I think it's an issue in terms of our resource restrictions, and it should be considered, but not at the expense of using it as a distraction from individual consumption in the West. I went to an Oxfam event for International Women's Day last night, and they had a little presentation about if you're going to have a kid, try and have a girl, because they act, especially in the developing world, as an linchpin of society, and they are just generally a lot more productive and useful in terms of community cohesion. And just one more point is, people have talked about kids in terms of consumption and being economic units. I think maybe another thing to consider is, although it's a controversial area, putting a limit on the number of kids you have, and there would be massive public outcry if you had a one-child limit here, like they do in China. But I'd say a point to consider is you can't have a decent quality of parenting beyond a certain point. If you have 100 kids, no one would argue you could be a decent parent to all of them. So there's got to be a cut-off somewhere. And that's my lot on
all right. Okay. Well, I was tempted to propose a vote on the uselessness of men, but I think I'll resist that.
I'm not saying they're useless, I'm just saying women are, according to Oxfam, more useful.
All right, and so very quickly, this man here.
Yeah, no one else has disputed the basic premise that the world's overpopulated, or that we have a population problem. Do you have any evidence for it?
Okay. All right. Well, hey, look, thanks. This is an interesting start. Got here. I mean, my first response would be to say, I don't accept this notion of particular children or particular people being a drain on society. They are society. We're all society. It's not that some people are outside society and sucking that society. Well, apart from possibly bankers.
Tory. Yes.
I mean, and the point actually was made slightly flippantly, but it is in fact a very good one. That the real, if there is a drain on society, it's coming from the top, not from the bottom.
Yeah.
But actually, we are all part of society, and we've got to find ways of living with each other and hopefully not too much against each other. And so, while of course it is true that some people are better parents than others, even if there were a means of enforcing some sort of system whereby only those who are deemed to be good parents before they are actually parents will be allowed to have children, which of course there isn't a means of doing that, you immediately run into the issue of eugenics. And always, whenever it's happened in the past, and it's happened in many different governments, people think of the Nazis in particular, but even the Swedes were doing it until 1974. And it's an extraordinary thing, but there was an active eugenics program, government-sponsored, in Sweden until 1974.
Wow.
And what you had was these people who thought they were doing it, in Sweden at any rate, for the good of wider society. And they thought, we're going to sort of ensure that society functions as well as possible by ensuring that the wrong sort of people don't have children. But of course, because they were the ones who were deciding who the wrong sort of people were, they were basically deciding people unlike us should not have children. And that has always been the theme of the eugenics discussions. And it has to be said, when you look at the history of the period from about 1840 up till about sort of 1960 or 1970, where was the worst parenting taking place? And it's a moot point, but I would say there'd be a strong case for saying it was the upper classes. Who's seen the King's Speech? Yeah. And the way in which the King and Queen treated their children there. And that was among the upper classes, that was the acceptable method of parenting. It was completely arm's length. You farmed them out to a nanny. There was no emotional engagement whatsoever. They managed to invent something which no previous civilization has ever managed to invent, which is parenting without love. And that was an extraordinary thing. And yet they were the people, it was their class, who were effectively deciding which people should be allowed to breed and which shouldn't in those societies which were practicing eugenics. So you can see the problem you immediately run into. That the moment you start to decide that some people should be allowed to reproduce and others shouldn't be allowed to reproduce, even if it's supposed to be for their own good, you start making very value-laden decisions, which are never, they cannot possibly be objective decisions. And I've worked amongst some of the poorest people on earth, and I've seen far more engaged and committed parenting in some of those societies than I've seen amongst some of the richest people in countries like this one. Absolutely. So it's very hard to make those judgments. Now, there is an issue with population. I mean, the last man was right in saying, yes, there is an issue with population. And it is one of the factors which loads the environment with extra pressure. There's no question about that. But I would challenge the basic formula which was put forward originally by Paul Ehrlich, which is I equals PAT, that the total impact of humanity on the planet equals population times affluence times technology. The research suggests that a far more accurate formulation would be I equals CAT, total impact equals consumers times affluence times technology. Because the truth is that there are large portions of the world's population who can simply not be classified as consumers. They are just not consuming any significant amount of resources at all. A man called David Satterthwaite of the IIED, the International Institute of Environment and Development, wrote a paper last year, which was very interesting indeed, where he looked at India, among other places, and looked at where the population growth was taking place. And there'd been a lot of talk from the Optimum Population Trust and others about how population growth was driving climate change. And he found that in India, population growth was almost entirely concentrated in the bottom 20% of society. And that bottom 20% was not just not consuming any significant amount of fossil fuel at all. A tiny amount of kerosene for their lamps, which most of them could scarcely afford at all, and so really a very, very small amount, and no others. But they were actually responsible for all the recycling and reuse of resources in India, and probably actually had a negative carbon impact altogether. Whereas the people at the top of society, the richest people in India, were scarcely reproducing at all, as very rich people, scarcely reproduce, and yet they were having a very big carbon impact indeed. And when you look at the world as a whole, that's kind of what you see. And there was an extraordinary gathering of 5 billionaires in the US 2 years ago, who all considered themselves socially conscious and forward-looking billionaires, and they sat down to decide what was the biggest environmental issue which had to be dealt with. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they chose population. Unsurprising, because it was the only issue for which they weren't responsible. And it's no coincidence that the people you hear most often articulating the need to stop people having babies are post-reproductive white men, because they are least responsible for that problem, even though they might be most responsible for all the problems of consumption, which the lady at the back so rightly brought up. And those 5 billionaires, if there were just 50,000 people living like they do, the impact would be overwhelming. It would be enormous. When you look at the way in which billionaires tend to live, with their yachts which consume in 10 minutes what the average African would use in an entire lifetime in terms of fossil fuel, with their swimming pools heated to 38 degrees all the year round, outdoor swimming pools so that they can lie there under the stars as if they were in the bath, with their fast cars, with their private planes, with all the rest of it, you see that the carrying capacity of the Earth is totally a function of consumption. There is no steady state carrying capacity of the world. You hear the Optimum Population Trust saying the carrying capacity of the world is 2 billion people. You say, well, 2 billion people doing what? 2 billion people living like us would overload the Earth, living like we do in the UK, whereas 2 billion people living like a rural villager in sub-Saharan Africa would scarcely be felt, especially in terms of resource depletion, because they don't have the financial resources to be using up ecological resources on any great scale. So it's, yes, it's a problem. Yes, it's a problem which I feel has been overblown by people who often have a vested interest in distracting attention from other problems, but also, almost uniquely amongst environmental issues, is a problem which appears to be peaking. And it looks as if by about 2060 or thereabouts, global population is going to peak, then plateau, then go into decline. Now, there's no such projection for consumption. There is no such projection for economic growth. There is no such projection for any of the other issues which are hammering the world's life support systems. And even when it comes to food, this is the area where population is meant to impact most directly. Where is the big impact on world food supplies coming from? Is it coming from the rising human population? No. It's coming from the rising livestock population, which is currently rising 2 or 3 times faster than the human population, such that it'll very soon overtake humanity in its total consumption of grains. At the moment it consumes about 800 million tons of grain a year. Human beings consume about 1 billion tons of grain a year. Biofuels, incidentally, take up another 100 million. But it's going to be only a few years now before livestock overtakes us. And the rate of growth of livestock, which of course is a function of consumption, there's no point at which that's assumed to start dropping. So I would put human population amongst the environmental problems we've got to look at, but I'd put it quite far down the list. Anyone else want to come in?